So our next speaker is Dr. Professor Andrew Nicholson with Stony Brook University, and the topic of his presentation is Patajali in the Eyes of His Opponents. Please welcome Dr. Nicholson.
Thanks very much, Veena, and thanks, Chris, for inviting me. I know we're getting restless here with 5 presenters, so I'll try to keep this relatively short, and I hope I can also touch upon some of the themes that were raised this morning, and I think I've got something to say about Bhavana a little later in the talk too, so we'll see how that goes. So, of course, one way of understanding the meaning of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is to pay very close attention to the language of his text. Another way, in a way that so far people haven't talked about as much, is looking at the reception history of this text. What people who were his near contemporaries in the first millennium CE said about Patanjali. And of course some of those people were sympathetic and some of those people were unsympathetic. And so I hope I don't ruin everyone's day by saying some not so nice things about Patanjali here. You have to have at least one Purvapaksha at every lecture, right? So I'm going to discuss briefly 3 critiques or implicit critiques of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. The first is probably familiar to many of you, so I won't spend too much time on it. That's Shankara's Advaita Vedanta critique in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya. I'll also spend a little more time, since it may be unfamiliar to some of you, with Kaundinya, who was a Bhashyakara. He wrote a commentary on the Pashupata Sutras. The Pashupatas were one of the major darshanas of the first millennium. And then finally, I will finish up with another expression of Pashupata doctrines, but this one coming from a text called the Ishvara Gita, the Song of Lord Shiva. And I recently wrote a book and with a translation and commentary on that text. I think if we all focus our minds, maybe it'll appear on the table outside. Because it's not there yet, but through the power of love, it's coming. So everyone concentrate. I'm counting on you, and by the end of my talk, it should be out there on the table. Okay? So, in the 8th century CE, the Vedanta philosopher Shankara found fault with what he considered to be Patanjali's anti-Vedic dualist philosophy, which relies on the Samkhya school's idea of 2 absolute, irreducible entities, one spirit, the other material nature, prakriti. Shankara, of course, is committed to non-dualism, Advaita, and so he argued in his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.3 that the dualism of both Samkhya and Yoga, and he understood them as 2 different schools. He may have actually been the first or one of the first to do that, to see Samkhya and Yoga as different instead of Patanjali's text as, in fact, an expression of Samkhya. So this is what Shankara said. Quote, "By the rejection of the Samkhya tradition, the Yoga tradition, too, has been rejected. That is because, contrary to revealed texts, the Yoga school teaches that primordial nature is an independent cause, even though this is taught neither in the Vedas nor among the people," unquote. So, for Shankara, the main problem is Patanjali's dualism. Patanjali is a Samkhya philosopher who is interested in yoga, and so he wrote an analysis of yoga that's based on Samkhya metaphysics. And I think this is widely understood in the first millennium as the project that Patanjali had. He was a Samkhya philosopher writing about yoga. I think later on people started to draw distinctions, and perhaps that started with Shankara's distinction of 2 separate schools instead of just 1 school, but eventually we started to see bigger divisions, or the yoga quote-unquote school became its own entity. When in fact, as many of you will know, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is just one of dozens of texts in the first millennium analyzing yoga from different perspectives. But for some reason, some historical accident, David Gordon White, I think, has recently written about in his biography of the Yoga Sutra. Nowadays we think of the Yoga Sutra as the classical or the essential yoga text. And this is clearly not what various Pashupata authors say about this text. So next I'll turn to Kaundinya, who, as I said, was a commentator. He wrote a commentary called the Pancharta Bhashya, the commentary on the 5 topics, which was a commentary on an earlier text, the Pashupata Sutras, that were discovered in the early 20th century. And they were actually published first in 1940 in Trivandrum. Many of you might not be familiar with it, but it is considered, it's in the Sarva Darshana Sangraha as one of the darshanas. And it was clearly a very influential one. It's the first recorded darshana or sect that takes Shiva as the highest god. So arguably the Pashupatas may be the earliest Shaiva philosophers. We have records of them in the Mahabharata, for instance. So I'll talk a little about what Kaundinya said in his Pancharta Bhashya. So he perhaps takes Samkhya Yoga, as he calls it, as his main opponent. He's very insistent on disproving what he calls Samkhya Yoga. And he understood that this word Samkhya Yoga is a single darshana. It's one darshana, it's not two. Okay? So first of all, I should say something about one of the 5 topics of the Pancharta Bhashya is yoga. And this is how yoga is defined multiple times in the text. So, Atmeshvara Samyogo Yogaha Pratyetavyaha. Yoga should be understood as the union of the self and God. Now I think for many yogis, especially yoga practitioners today, they try to find this statement in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or the Bhashya, and it's not there. Because this is not Patanjali's understanding of yoga, at least the highest yoga. For Patanjali, of course, we've said it before, we'll say it again, yoga is chitta vritti narodha. So this is a fundamental disagreement between Patanjali and the Pashupatas. And oftentimes people interpret Yoga Sutra 1-2 as an expression of this highest samadhi, a sampradnyata samadhi, where there's a cessation of mental activity, chitta vritti, right? That is not the goal, emphatically not the goal of Pashupata Yoga, or for that matter, later Shaiva yogas, Shaiva Siddhanta, for instance, or Shaiva Tantric yogas, which were influenced. So you can think of the Pashupatas perhaps as the great-great-grandfathers of things like Hatha Yoga. And I think nowadays, for whatever reason, again, series of historical accents, we tend to think of Patanjali as having the kind of unbroken lineage to modern yoga, but I think there's a much stronger argument to be made for Shaiva Yoga as the real incubator of what we now think of as modern yoga. So let's go back to this Pancharta Bhashya, perhaps from the 6th century. See, it's very hard to date these texts. But he says another thing about Samkhya Yoga, as he calls it, Patanjali's yoga. He's very critical of it, so this is one thing he says. For it has been said that those who are liberated by Samkhya Yoga and who are masters of Samkhya Yoga should all be remembered as beasts, pashus, from the god Brahma down to the birds, unquote. So this requires a little explanation. If you don't know Pashupata Shaivism, why are they beasts? This is not just an example of yogic trash talking from the 6th century Common Era, although it is that. It is also a theological statement, a reference to one of a trio of theological concepts that went on to influence other Hindu sects. According to the Pashupatas, a Pashu, or beast, is a person or jivatman, an individual self who is not yet liberated. The word Pati, master, refers to Lord Shiva himself, who is the Pashupati. And this is where we get the name Pashupata, the worshippers or followers of Pashupati, the master of beasts, Shiva. Shiva is the protector of all beings, and it is he who is ultimately responsible for bondage and for liberation. The third category is the pasha, or fetter, a bond. And it is through the fetters created by Lord Shiva that beings are bound to the cycle of suffering and rebirth. And it is also Shiva who removes these fetters. So we require Shiva's grace to be liberated. It's not through our own power alone, as some yogas portray it, but in fact, like some other theistic yogas, It's through God's grace that we become liberated. And the playful image invoked through this trio of alliterative words, Pashu, Pati, Pasha, is the nomadic life of the pastoral cattle herder. And I think in this definition of yoga as Samyoga, or Atmeshvara Samyoga, we find what I think, if you look at the Mahabharata, sections like the Narayaniya or the Bhagavad Gita, is the mainstream understanding of yoga. Yoga is union, it's yoking. However, for Patanjali, at least as I read him, the highest yoga, which is Prajnata Samadhi, is a kind of viyoga, it's a disunion, which causes some cognitive dissonance. How can yoga be the opposite of itself, right? Well, here it isn't. And I think this was probably for the theistic traditions that we think of retrospectively as Hindu traditions. This was, in fact, the mainstream understanding of yoga, as reflected in the Bhagavad Gita, as reflected in these Pashupata texts, and not viyoga, or cessative yoga, as we'll call it. So what's wrong? What's so bad about Kaivalya, according to these Pashupatas? Well, here's another thing that Kaundinya says. This is his commentary on Pashupata Sutra 538, if you're interested to go look it up. He says, quote, "Those who are liberated by means of Samkhya Yoga attain aloneness, Kaivalya, which is devoid of knowledge of what is self and what is other than self, like those who have fainted. But the person who is united with God possesses knowledge," unquote. So here I think we have a deeply unsympathetic reading of Kaivalya. We've been trying to come up with creative ways of dealing with the problem of Kaivalya. Stephanie's talking about how this sounds like solitary confinement or torture or something. It doesn't sound very nice, does it? Aloneness is what the literal meaning of this word is. I don't want to be alone for all of eternity. I want to be with everybody in heaven or in Brahman or whatever the Vedantins say it is. I don't want to be alone, right? And I think one of the difficulties when it comes to modern yogis interpreting Patanjali's text is it doesn't say the things they wanted to say. It doesn't talk about union. It's not about all the rivers uniting into the ocean and us all being together. No, it's not that. But that is the mainstream understanding of yoga. It's a kind of laya, into Brahman, if you're reading the Upanishads. And so this is different than that. And as some people like Philip this morning talked about, this is also heavily Buddhist influenced. Now although some people tend to think of this as like the fundamental Hindu yoga, I really question whether, it's not more Buddhist or Jain in many ways than Hindu. So it's like a swoon. And we were grappling this morning, I think, with, well, how can we conceptualize asamprajnata samadhi? It's not unconsciousness, Ian pointed out, but it's not quite consciousness either. Those are the wrong categories. And then Staneshwar was talking about Husserl, and maybe this is some kind of non-intentional state, some state that Western phenomenology hasn't even been able to think about or conceptualize adequately yet. Well, that's the more sympathetic reading of this state. The less sympathetic reading is, I know what Chitta-vritti nirodha is. It's the kind of consciousness this cup has, namely no consciousness at all. It's the non-existence of consciousness. And Stuart also talked earlier about, even in the Yoga Sutras, this idea of false Kaivalya. Well, I think one way of understanding the Pashupata understanding of Kaivalya is all Kaivalya is false Kaivalya. It's not liberating you. You're still a beast. You're still stuck in the round rebirth. It may feel good for a while to obliterate your consciousness, but you're inevitably going to start up again and experience suffering. And one of the other topics of the 5 topics of the Pashupata Sutras is the end of suffering, dukkanta. So they too were concerned with this, but they said Kaivalya is not the way to get there. This is a false end of suffering. So this is a deeply unsympathetic / hostile understanding of the Yoga Sutras. But now I'm going to talk about another Pashupata text that I think takes a more moderate view towards Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And this is called the Ishvara Gita. I've translated it as Lord Shiva's Song. So let's everyone do a Samyama on this book right here. Concentrate, and it will appear. Okay? So this text is a section from the Kurma Purana. It's one of the 18 Mahapuranas, or great Puranas, perhaps composed in the 8th century. That might be a little earlier. I think there are different layers of composition of this text. But I translated it recently, and there's a lot to say about this text I'm not going to talk about today. For instance, its influence on modern yoga. Vivekananda knew this text, and I think this is probably where he got the idea of 4 yogas. As many of you know, usually in the medieval period, the Bhagavad Gita was said to have 3 yogas: jnana, bhakti, and karma. But this other yoga, Raja Yoga, which for him is a kind of Vivekananda reconstructs Patanjali's ideas. Well, in the if you take a look at Ishvara Gita, this is 424. It talks about 4 yogas. It doesn't call the 4th yoga Raja Yoga. It calls it Dhyana Yoga, yoga of meditation. But it's very similar to the way that Vivekananda formulates it. And it's very clear that he knew this text and had read Ishvara Gita. I also don't have time to talk about some really interesting questions of intertextuality, because the Ishvara Gita takes entire chunks of the Bhagavad Gita, but again recontextualizes them in this Pashupata framework, which is fascinating, and led Franklin Edgerton, an old Orientalist, to say, these guys, they just ran out of ideas and ripped off the Bhagavad Gita. I don't think that's what's going on, but if you want to find out what is going on, go read the book, okay? So let's talk about how the Ishvara Gita conceptualizes Patanjali's yoga. So this is what it says. In chapter 11 is where it mainly talks about yoga, the last chapter of this text, and here's what it says. The yoga in which one's own essence is known to be empty, free from all false appearances, is named the yoga of non-being, abhava yoga. Through it one sees the self. The yoga in which one discerns the self as eternally blissful, free from blemish, and united with me, this is Shiva speaking, is called the great yoga of the Supreme Lord, Maha Yoga, unquote. So we have these 2 yogas, the Abhava Yoga, yoga of non-being, and the Maha Yoga, the great yoga. The yoga of non-being described here is not Buddhist yoga, in spite of the text at one point calling it shunya, empty. So we're not talking about Madhyamakas here, okay? This refers to cessative yogas, and Patanjali is the most famous example of this, that do not understand the ultimate state of liberation as union with the supreme deity or ultimate reality. Of course, Ishvara appears in the Yoga Sutra. I'm sure we'll argue more about that later. But it's pretty clear to me, and I think most of the people in this room, that Ishvara Pranidhana is a preparatory practice. It's not the highest samadhi. Well, here, the highest samadhi is, in fact, Atmeshvara Samyoga. So this, by means of cessation of mental activity, these Abhava yogas enable the practitioner to discern the existence of a pure, eternal self that is free from prakriti, material nature. And note here, this is a disagreement with the Pashupata Sutra's Bhashya by Kamdinya. Kamdinya says there's no knowledge that arises from the state of Kaivalya. It's like a swoon, it's like being unconscious. They're saying, no, there's some knowledge even. It's your ability to discern, and Samkhya is called the Purusha, and distinguish it from Prakriti. This is important, but it is incomplete. So now Patanjali's yoga is a kind of preparatory practice for this other yoga, which is called Mahayoga. So this Abhava yoga is powerless to move the yogi from the dualistic discernment of the self's ontological difference from material nature to the self's ultimate power and purpose, which is in fact oneness with God. So although the Ishvara Gita chapter 11 introduces the distinction between the 2 yogas, the yoga of non-being and the great yoga, it subsequently presents a fusion of Pashupata and Patanjali yoga traditions. So it goes all through the 8 limbs systematically and redefines them in some very interesting ways. For instance, you may be interested to know regarding Ishvara Pranidhana, it actually calls it Ishvara Pujana. So take that for what you will. So The most obvious bar in Patanjali is the adoption of the 8 limbs of yoga, but it presents the 8 limbs a little bit differently. So here's what it says about the 8 limbs at the very beginning. This is verse 11:11.